There's a dynamic when you are a politician at some event in your constituency or elsewhere, and you look at the cast list of speakers, and you look down and you recognise the man or woman who is the brilliant after-dinner speaker who will have everybody rolling about in the aisles, and you think to yourself, oh bloody hell, I hope I'm on before they are. There's a similar dynamic when the bright guy in the class has done his bit and you're next on. So please, we move from the philosopher and the academic to one of the politicians here. This is one of the biggest set of interlocking challenges I think any of us have ever faced. We are, as Alan has pointed out, facing a world of a complexity which, as politicians, academics, normal citizens, we actually struggle to comprehend. And there's no shortage of attempted analyses and prescriptions for what might follow through. And may I just be the latest in a long line of people to commend the project, the sponsors and the John Smith Trust Foreign Policy Centre and elsewhere, and Alan and those who've contributed, for a really thought-provoking book. I have a politician's worry about academic terminology and the language that can be used in books like this. But I felt challenged. I was pleased to be able to follow most of the terminology as I wended my way through the different chapters. But I guess what it said in the end was that those of us from across the political spectrum who have lived through the policy challenges of the last few years, debated them in parliaments and ministries or wherever, are all still slightly at sea about what the responses need to be. And I was thinking, you can put down the silo and say, do we look at this set of challenges through recent experience in Kosovo, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq? And if you do, you get one set of lessons that you can draw, and they're not necessarily always the most obvious ones. And I speak as a liberal who supported the intervention in Kosovo and still does. A liberal who supported the intervention in Afghanistan and still does. And a liberal who opposed the intervention in Iraq. Although, and sometimes this may not be true of all my colleagues, if one looks at the way that people like me, who had the responsibility for putting our party's position across in the Commons during the build-up to the war, when Wing Campbell was ill, I found myself in the bear pit, sometimes feeling slightly lonely. But we were arguing not that Saddam Hussein or others should be ignored, that we should be oblivious to the threat, that we should let what was continue, but that if we were to tackle people like Saddam Hussein and the undoubted threat that they represented to peace in the region, and perhaps more broadly in the world, then we had to do it under international law. And while I accept the warning that international law and the UN as its embodiment is not without its problems and its difficulties, I think you have to have a pretty good set of reasons to put it to one side if you are about to embark on something of the magnitude of Iraq. Not just as a security issue, as a military series of events, but as something that I think will be a legacy, not just in this country but across the world for generations. Symbolically, it will be as important to the rest of the world as it has been individually for the people caught up in the bloody conflict and its aftermath in these past few years. In that particular silo, you might lead to a particular set of conclusions, but as Alan's overview of the sets of challenges that we face illustrate, we face a whole series of problems. Again, we can look through the prism of ideas and whether or not we are confronting a new ideology, faith, whatever term we wish to apply to it, which it is a manifestation of some grief, genuine grievances and others, not just about ideas, but about the conditions in which people live. And quickly we can segue, therefore, into the economic, the environmental, and all the other things that come to play a part. I think as a liberal, you are forced to be an optimist. I don't just mean that from the political reality of trying to exist here at Westminster. I think it is a natural part of your philosophy. It needs to be. You have some basic faith in humankind and the way we think to each other, despite all the evidence against it. And if I'm being optimistic about where we are after 9/11, it is that I think we've recognised that there are mistakes, that the unilateral response, the bilateral response, to borrow and twist the phrase, was wrong, that we need to take a new approach. We need to recognise the fallibility of the international legal order and put our energies into finding solutions to fix that. We need to recognise the lack of equity in the distribution of wealth, of environmental benefits, whatever. And certainly in recent discussions I've been party to and observed where American policymakers and others anticipate what the next American president might do, whether they come from the left or the right, the neocon perspective or whatever, I think there's a general recognition that what went before can't continue, that international law must mean more, that even the mighty American state must learn to pool its sovereignty with others and live within a different world order. But also too that we in Europe, and not just the UK, have a responsibility if we are to contribute more than just ideas and money to problems. We need to have greater capability too, because in military terms we are struggling to meet our aspirations, our responsibilities in places like Afghanistan, and we run the risk that for all the wrong reasons we will fail at what I think is a good cause. So none of what I have seen in the last few years, none of the arguments we've had here in Parliament has turned me against the idea of liberal intervention, and none of it has suggested to me that we can opt out. I think globalisation in all its many aspects is an inclusive process whether you want it to be or not. We therefore have got to find the new tools and the new ways of expressing our thinking which will tackle those problems and mean that the people in the different parts of the world, like India, China, so many other places, feel part of it and have a stake in it and work with us to tackle the problems. Because as Jeffrey Sachs and others have just recently reminded us in very potent terms, we only have one wee planet, and at the way we're going, we will not have much of it left in very short order. So I think that the arguments in the book, the challenge to all of us, whichever part of the spectrum we put ourselves, are timely, important. What they don't do for me is say that we must turn our back on the last decade of interventions and others. We just have to be clear about why we do them and the way in which we do them.
Thank you.